We're going to look at a second social reformer. We've tried to choose three very different ones. So Hannah More was the first Victorian, interestingly, influencing the development of British society very much around 200 years ago. How many of you have heard of Henry Dunant? Let me see. Only half of you. Very, very interesting. Henry Dunant is the most incredibly interesting figure, and I have been fascinated by his story ever since I lived in Geneva, or near Geneva, and we learned about him. Let me just read you from the website of the Nobel Prizes. John Henry Dunant's life from May 1828 to October 1910 is a study in contrasts. He was born into a wealthy home but died in a hospice. In middle age, he juxtaposed great fame with total obscurity, and success in business with bankruptcy. In old age, he was virtually exiled from the Genevan society of which he had once been an ornament, and died in a lonely room, leaving a bitter testament. His passionate humanitarianism was the one constant in his life, and the Red Cross his living monument. So Henry Dunant founded the Red Cross movement. So what is this story behind the remarkable Swiss man who founded the Red Cross movement, especially as most Christians have never heard of him? Well, I want to try and tell you his story. And again, I hope, I find it fascinating personally. I don't quite know why. And I don't know why, but I quite often find myself a little bit sort of choked up in telling his story. So if that happens, just, be patient and I'll get over it. Anyway, it's a lovely quote here. Why could not advantage be taken of a time of relative calm and quiet to investigate and try to solve a question of such immense and worldwide importance, both from the humane and Christian standpoint? As we go through the story, you'll understand at what point he made that comment and what it was referring to. So, the Dunants were an affluent Genevan family. They were deeply Calvinist and strongly committed to demonstrating their faith through social work. And in 1828 was born their firstborn, John Henry, known as Henry, who was the oldest of 5 children. He went to Calvin College in Geneva, and this is a picture of it. The building is still there. The school is still there, started by Calvin himself. And yet poor Henry was asked to leave the school when he was 14 for repeatedly failing his exams. And when the headmaster told him it was, he had to leave, he said, "But sir, I've won the piety prize several times." So piety meaning, personal devotions and so on. But alas, because he kept on getting 2 out of 10 for Latin, they said you had to go. After this, he devoted himself to participating in the activities of the Reformed Church, and then was drawn into the evangelical Réveil, or revival, movement, which had begun 30 years earlier with the arrival in Geneva of the Scotsman Robert Haldane. So interestingly, we heard about Hannah More, the evangelical movement in the early 1800s. Well, Haldane came from Scotland, the fruit of that revival movement, to Geneva and began to teach the people studying theology in the seminary in Geneva, they were going to become pastors in the Protestant church, the Reformed church. He taught them to read the Bible because they studied pretty much philosophy, and they only occasionally looked into the Bible. I think it was the book of Psalms, that was all they looked at. So he actually introduced them to the rest of the Bible, to Jesus, and to the gospel, and so on. Anyway, so this revival movement was taking place within the Swiss, the French part of Switzerland, and it's called the Réveil movement. So around the age of 18, Henry gave his life to the Lord in this church. It's still there today. It's called the Oratoire in Geneva. And almost at once he founded something called the Thursday Association, which was a group of similarly minded young men who met for Bible study and to help the poor in various ways. So Henry spent much of his time visiting the sick and the poorest of the poor, who were the prisoners in the city jail, who served their sentences in desperate conditions. He would read the Bible to them, and also stories of travel and adventure. Now, evangelism and social work, which he was passionate about, didn't earn a living. And so, age 21, his father persuaded him or found for him an apprenticeship with a banking house in Geneva called Lulinen Sauté. This enabled him to travel to France and connect with other groups of young Christians. And in 1851, so he was born in 1828, so that's when he's about 23 years old, this Thursday Association actually sent 2 medical students to Paris to organise similar gatherings there. And a while later, the association was renamed as the Union Chrétienne de Jeunes Gens, or UCJG. Now, this allied itself with something called the YMCA. Have you all heard of the YMCA? The Young Men's Christian Association. That had been that organisation had been founded in London just a few years earlier, in 1844, by someone called George Williams, and it had a very similar vision and ethos. These groups were organised and run by the young people themselves. No pastor, no parents. It was a truly youth movement. And they met for prayer, for Bible study, to grow in their faith, and they organised evangelistic outreaches and practical service. And they also ran social activities, which brought together young Christians from very different backgrounds, and in a unique kind of institution. So that, when I read this, I had been working in Youth with a Mission for a long time, and I thought, this is us. This could have been Youth with a Mission in the 1850s. It was so similar. It's remarkable. Tim's nodding because he's done a YWAM school also. So all of Dunant's spare time and much of his small salary went into the work of the Christian Unions, the French kind of group. And he visited the Netherlands in 1851 and helped to encourage a new group there. And also he would travel to Paris, and he was fast becoming one of the leading figures in this movement, young Christian movement on the continent. But however, alongside his gifts lay some glaring weaknesses too. One of his co-leaders who founded with him the Geneva branch of the Christian Unions, he wrote to his brother in Paris to say, "My task has not always been an easy one. I had Dunant to restrain. What a pity it is that he is so lacking in judgment. He has amazing zeal and energy. How I wish this dear friend of ours had rather more common sense, tact and judgment." Now, take note of that, because I think the rest of his story is a little bit of a development of these two things. So in 1853, the Christian Unions of France, Belgium and Switzerland, because they'd spread to those 3 countries, were keen to form a French-speaking federation. But Dunant was the only one who objected and said, no, we should think bigger than that, not just of a French-speaking union of these movements, but a global one as well. Let's join with the English-speaking YMCA movement, which had also spread to the States and to Australia. And Dunant's vision prevailed, partly because he wrote frequently about his vision and ideas, which were published in the international newsletter of the movement. So he was a great communicator. He got his ideas out. He was passionate about mobilizing people, persuading people, convincing them. And in the end, Dunant helped write the charter of the International YMCA, which held its first global congress in Paris 2 years later in 1855. But the year 1853 was significant for Dunant in 2 other ways. First, he met the... Oh gosh, I've just been jumping over. Sorry. That's the picture of him when he was in 1855. This is up in the centre of Geneva. This is the house. There's a plaque on it that says L'Union Chrétienne de Jeunes Gens de Genève, YMCA. At the initiative of Henry Dunant and Max Perrault, it established its first kind of centre here in 1852. So you can see that in the centre of Geneva today. But back to 1853. So Dunant met the American authoress Harriet Beecher Stowe in Geneva. She was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. This book had brought the harsh realities of life as an American slave to a wider audience. And from now on, Dunant was a firm abolitionist, and he promoted the cause wherever he went. Once again, we see a link here with Hannah More, who was likewise promoting the abolitionist cause. Secondly, that year, Dunant's work with the bank took him to the French colony of Algeria as a temporary manager in the colonies Suisse de Sétif, which was owned by the bank that he worked for. And despite his inexperience, he succeeded in his task and was sent out again in 1854. He became intoxicated by the culture of the Orient and wrote a book about it, which was very well received. And through other writings, he began to be seen as a man of letters and was admitted to several learned societies, which was a remarkable achievement for someone who had been kicked out of school, age 14. So, when he was 27, Dunant decided to hand over the work of fostering the YMCA branches to others and to concentrate on his newly found business career. Spurred on by his success in managing the work in Algeria, he set up his own company out there and took a concession on 77 hectares of fertile agricultural land from the French colonial authority, for which he was going to plant, use for cultivating wheat. His vision was to grind flour from his own farm and neighbouring ones as well, to export it back to Europe. This enterprise needed a substantial amount of capital, and he used his connections with many of the wealthy families in Geneva and his parents' circle to raise £500,000. He went and built the mill for grinding the flour, despite not having obtained permission to access the water he needed to power the mills and irrigate the land. Took a big risk there. Well, in 1859, he managed to double the capital of his promising venture, but he still lacked the vital water, because there was no other source of powering the mills. There was no electricity, there was no diesel engines available there, and in fact they hadn't been invented. So he needed, it was a water-powered mill that could grind the flour. So despite having doubled the capital now, and everyone in Geneva thought he was a very successful businessman, he still lacked this vital water. And his impatience with the bureaucracy and slowness of the colonial administration reached the point where he decided to take matters to the top. He would present his case to the Emperor, Napoleon III. So, at that time, June 1859, Napoleon was in northern Italy, leading the French army and its Italian allies against Sicilian, mainly against the Austrians, who had occupied northern Italy since 1815. And Dunant arrived there the day after one of the 19th century's bloodiest battles in Europe on June 24th. So that's the Emperor he went to find in northern Italy, and that's one of the sketches from the battle. So he arrived the day after this horrendous battle where I think over 300,000 soldiers were pitched against each other, and more than 40,000 had been killed or injured in just one day. Many just being left to die where they fell. Dunant was shocked, and quickly putting aside his business mission, he immediately got involved, bringing water, arranging supplies, getting the victorious French army to release Austrian doctors that they were still holding prisoner, writing down the last words from dying soldiers to send to their families, and mobilizing local people to tend the wounded from both sides. The week he spent there was to change the course of this 31-year-old's life. Back in Geneva, Dunant was haunted by what he'd seen and experienced, and as a result he wrote his thoughts and reflections down in a book called A Memory of Solferino. And on my desk is the English version of it, which I've not brought with me. Anyway, that's the original French version. Now, this book had three parts. First was the glories of the battle, which is how actually most reports of war in the mid-19th century were presented. And that was, in a sense, what kept getting young people to sign up or to enlist and to go to war, because they had read about these glorious adventures and so on that they thought warfare was about. So the glories of the battle was the first part of the book, and then he wrote about the hideous aftermath which he had seen with his own eyes, and the immense suffering of the wounded, so much of which could have been alleviated with a few simple policies and preparations. And then in the last part of the book he set out a triple appeal. He said during peacetime societies should be formed of volunteers who would be prepared to go and assist on the battlefield. Secondly, the volunteer doctors and nurses who went should be afforded protection and assistance on the battlefield to do this work. And thirdly, governments should formulate certain international principles and conventions which would allow the development of these societies to care for the war wounded in different European countries. Thank you. So here's the book, A Memory of Solferino, and which you can buy in Geneva. It's not long. This is the English translation, and he just tells this incredible story. It's a little book, but in it he put his vision, his passion, his conviction that something was desperately wrong and needed to change. So Dunant printed this book in 1862 at his own expense and sent it around all his networks, to the YMCA networks, to business circles, to the leading families, and to royalty and aristocracy in different countries. His challenge stirred many hearts, especially in his own city. And as a result, the Geneva Society for Public Utility took up the cause and formed a committee in 1863 to look into implementing Dunant's ideas. He was the secretary and devoted himself to mobilizing people behind the vision of what would eventually become the International Red Cross. So there he is, top right, and the other people, there was a general, there was a lawyer, there was another doctor. He'd actually been with the doctor bottom left there at Solferino at the same time. Appia, the doctor, he was also a member of the same church, the Oratoire church in Geneva. So these were the 5 people who formed that very first committee. And a year later, largely through the efforts of Dunant, the same committee convened an international conference of 16 nations in Geneva to discuss the possibility of making warfare more humane. And in August 1864, the representatives of 12 of those countries signed the first Geneva Convention. So in just 5 years, Dunant had seen a personal vision transformed into an international treaty. But only 3 years later, before he turned 40, Dunant went bankrupt, largely because he had neglected his investment, his business in North Africa, and he was devoting his time to the Red Cross movement. And the result, sadly, was he was ostracized by the Calvinist Genevan Society, which had put up most of the capital for his business. And because they considered defaulting on a debt one of the worst crimes. And so he was effectively ostracized, driven out of Geneva, and spent the rest of the last 43 years of his life mostly in poverty and obscurity. And this is partly because the other members of the committee sought to downplay the influence of Dunant, because he had become an embarrassment. And they marginalized his role in the foundation of the Red Cross to the point that he was almost written out of the story. Yet, in the mid-1890s, he was discovered by a newspaper editor, because he by then was in the German part of Switzerland. He was just living a quiet life, hardly known by anybody, but still being chased down for his debts. Let me just plug in the... And so this newspaper editor was on holiday from St. Gallen, one of the Swiss cities, and he published an article about Dunant's role in establishing the Red Cross, which people had just not known about, just kind of 30 years later. And this spread all the way around European newspapers, and he received renewed attention and support. And after that, and towards the end of his life, he received a number of awards and prizes, culminating in that award of the first Nobel Peace Prize. So, I find that an extraordinary story, and he died in 1910. But the end of his life was tragic because he never really he was haunted still by being hounded down because of these debts, and so he was never really able to somehow to live to resolve these incredible tensions and contradictions in his life between incredible success and. Yeah. Anyway, I can What have we got? We've got a few minutes, and you can stop the tape now because my talk has ended. Bye.